Olá, boa tarde. Hello, good afternoon or good evening. Dear all, I will address to the attendees in English. My name is Beethoven Alvarez. I'm Latin professor here at the Federal Fluminense University in Niterói, Rio de Janeiro. And I would like to welcome all of you to the 29th seminar on classical studies at the Fluminense Federal University. I need to thank FAPERJ, that is our funding agents, state funding agents that, together with the postgraduate program on language studies, help us with financial assistance. I have to thank very much. Today, now, we have the first conference of this seminar, and we will have Professor Henry Stead. Here you can see him, from St. Andrews. Today, his talk is entitled Red Antiquity, British Communist Classics in the Early Cold War. Professor Henry Stead, he is lecturer in Latin at the University of St. Andrews, in St. Andrews, Scotland. There, I had the privilege of meeting him in 2020, 2019, during a postdoctoral research period. It was great to meet him there. But before St. Andrews, Harry Stead was a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at Open University from 2016 to 2019. His current research project is called Brave New Classics. It's a good title. It began in May 2016 as a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship hosted by Open University until May 2019. The project investigated the unlikely but electric convergence of classics and British communists to 1956. The project has since extended its scope and now explores the relationship between world communism and the classics, and aims for the BADC website to become a key platform for international and collaborative research into the subject. The work dovetails with his previous study on working class engagements with Greek and Roman culture in Britain and Ireland in the beginning of the 19th century. He was the research associate on the Mayo AHRC-funded research project into working class receptions of ancient Greek and Roman culture, led by Professor Edith Hall and hosted by King's College London from 2013 to 2015. Their website can be visited, and their jointly edited volume, Greek and Roman Classics and the British Struggle for Social Reform, Bloomsbury 2015, is currently available in libraries. Additionally, and I think that's the way we follow, they have with Henry Stead, with Edith Hall, have a joint authored book published by Routledge in 2020, entitled A People's History of Classics. And I think that your talk will deal with a bit with the content of the book. He has papers published in Brazilian journals. I'd like to highlight it, such as Classica in 2023, and a a paper published in Nuncius Antiquus as well in 2021. And in 2021 as well, he has already talked for us here in Federal Fluminense University in our, at that time, lecture series that we held by the Center for Classical Studies here. And so he is already known by Brazilian scholars and students. So it's a pleasure to have you here again, even it is remotely, but we expect that one day you can come in person. But by now, facing difficult forces that put us in this situation, I give you the floor to your stage.
Great. Thank you very much, Beethoven. Thank you for a wonderful, warm welcome. And yeah, and thanks for reminding me of those Brazilian connections that I miss. Now, I believe I can use the slides now. Is that right, Beethoven? Yeah, great. So let's just see if, yeah, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here, if not with you, and I do hope to come to Brazil one day. But for now, I'd yeah, very much like to extend my thanks to Beethoven and all the organisers, and then I'm just going to begin my talk. Okay, so the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, began with the words, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Thus, it was cemented in socialist discourse that history proceeds through stages, with one ruling class being replaced by another. In that same document, the two classically educated Germans, Marx and Engels, began their survey of historical social order with an example from classical antiquity. They wrote, "In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves, etc." Now, references to the ancient Greeks and Romans are present in almost every early Marxist text, which is why the history of classics and communism, despite ostensibly being unusual bedfellows, are intimately entangled. While the associations with bourgeois culture left the discipline of classics vulnerable to attack and marginalization under communist governments, its bounty of historical and mythological exemplar was frequently appropriated by revolutionaries in the struggle for the emancipation of the international proletariat and the overthrow of capitalism. Identifying ancient Greece and Rome in the Marxist foundation texts as key examples of slave economies meant that classical antiquity was to remain central to longue durée Marxist historical analyses. While there are, of course, recurrent features in communist engagements with classical antiquity, it was by no means as monolithic as we might imagine. Even within the Soviet bloc, different communist classicisms emerged, often drawing on each region's special claim to the Greco-Roman tradition locally. In this paper, I hope to give a flavour, that's all I'm attempting, to give a flavour of Britain's red antiquity, first in the works of some British communist scholars of classical antiquity, so British communist classicists, and then an example of how such radical classical scholarship was picked up and used by leftist artists who sought in their revolutionary, in this case theatrical practice, to open up classical antiquity for working class audiences and thereby hasten the advent of socialism. Why have I chosen to share this research with you? You may well ask. As I explained in my abstract, I wanted to make clear that while the Greco-Roman classics have long been used to bolster and to naturalize social inequalities by imperialist establishments and, for example, fascists, neo-fascists, and etc., it remains and it has long been a contested cultural space, drawing appropriation from by groups across the political spectrum. It is not the reserve of the right. We would imagine from reading certain recent publications that the classics were the preserve of the reactionary and fascist right. There are, however, and have long been, other sides of classical antiquity, and these include progressive, anti-imperialist, feminist, and revolutionary appropriations of classical antiquity, revealing that while antiquity has indeed provided the curriculum of empire and bolstered conservative resistance to change, it has also provided cultural nourishment, inspiration, and instruction for people and peoples engaged in the pursuit of radical change and social justice. In A People's History of Classics, which Beethoven kindly mentioned, published in 2020, Edith Hall and I chose to, and I quote, to emphasize the historical instrumentality of the legacy of Greece and Rome in progressive and enlightened causes, to refute the argument that a classical education is intrinsically elitist or reactionary. In part, our goal was to redress the balance of the perception of classics, both inside and beyond the academy, and to encourage colleagues to do the same. The topics focused on by communist scholars in the 20th century included previously neglected topics of ancient, for example, of ancient structures of enslavement, material culture, crafts, technology, workers, attitude to work and its value, and everyday life. But historical and mythological figures were also selected for their usefulness to communist ideology, including the brothers Gracchi, Marcus Junius Brutus, Prometheus, who defied the gods to help mortals, and Marx's most splendid fellow, Spartacus, a figure highly favored in literature for children and young adults in the Soviet sphere. But between 1947 and 1956, the years I've chosen to focus on, we find in the intellectual and cultural output of the on the left of British culture, a distinctly Cold War classics, intent on using Greco-Roman antiquity as a weapon in the struggle against US imperialism and for the advent of communism. Since 1913, I've been involved with a network called Classics and Communism. Over the past decade, there have been 2 international conferences organized by David Mowrin in Ljubljana University, Slovenia, and Elżbieta Olechowska in Warsaw, Poland. And these conferences resulted in the volumes Classics and Communism 2013 and Classics and Class 2016. These books are largely concerned with the fate of classical philology and the classical education under Soviet communism in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. More recently, the same group of scholars investigated ancient theatre and again mainly Soviet communism in Central and Eastern Europe, resulting in a 3rd volume, the one in the middle, Classics and Communism in Theatre, published in 2019. They have done the important job of enabling classical scholars from diverse regions across the former Soviet Union and Soviet bloc to express their views on the impact of Soviet communism on the discipline of classics, which, as you might have imagined, was not inconsiderable. Scholars in the Soviet bloc were also to greater and lesser degrees isolated from Western classics due to restrictions on travel across the Iron Curtain, and therefore restricted from collaboration with Western colleagues, not to mention the resulting penuria librorum, or shortage of books. From a Western perspective, this seems particularly strange terminology when addressing Brazilian colleagues, but from a Western perspective, A People's History of Classics, co-written by Edith and me, showed some glimpses of the creative influence of Marxism on several scholars, writers and artists who worked with classical antiquity in Britain. There have been quite a number of discrete studies conducted over the years, especially into Marxist historiography, but there is an extraordinary amount of work yet to be done on classics and communism as both a dominant and a countercultural ideological force worldwide. A relative terra incognita is found when considering the impact of world communism on the reception of classical antiquity in the so-called Global South, although several studies are beginning to illuminate the situation in China, India, and the Americas, even though no systematic study yet exists. While the discipline of classics, especially the study of ancient Greek and Latin, suffered under the Soviet regimes, in other and sometimes surprising ways, classics, broadly conceived as the cultural activity surrounding the ideas, images, texts, and other remains of ancient Greece and Rome, can be seen to have flourished both within and beyond the academy. For example, within the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, vernacular translations of classical texts flourished. Marxist-Leninist studies of ancient history and archaeology thrived in certain areas, and Soviet museums pioneered new ways of increasing popular access to their exhibitions. In October 2001, at my home institution of University of St. Andrews, we held an international workshop called A Proletarian Classics. Its aim was to explore further the conflicted and complex relationship between classics and communism, this time using the prism of the slightly ambiguous or polysemic concept of proletarianism. We asked how Soviet ideology and cultural policy might have changed the experience of classics, both inside and beyond the academy, and inside and beyond the Soviet sphere. We had participants from Belarus, Bulgaria, East Germany, Ireland, Italy, Norway, Poland, Russia, Scotland, Slovenia, and Ukraine. The proceedings were published in a special issue of the international and open access journal Clotho at the end of 2020. And this edition made good progress in terms of interdisciplinarity and of broadening the scope to include non-academic receptions of antiquity. But scholars tended to limit their focus on the proletarian classics found within their own national context, and looking more broadly at transnational connections might be a route forward for another step. When we study so-called Western European communist classics, we tend to find countercultural radicals using Marxist ideas and pioneering Soviet aesthetics to challenge local convention. They were often also passionate advocates for civil rights and the kinds of freedom of expression that were sadly denied their Second World counterparts. In the USSR and the regions forming the Soviet bloc, for many, Marxism-Leninism was the oppressive convention against which the spirited rebels yearned to defy. That said, space is now emerging, and slowly emerging, for more nuanced evaluations of the debt of Marxism to the experience of antiquity. As my colleague Elżbieta Olorczewska recently put it, the time has now come to recognize that half a century of communism did not result only in a spectacular economic and ideological collapse of the practical application of communist principles, but also accelerated a much needed transformation of methodology and focus, resulting in a better understanding of the ancient world. Now for a bit of historical context relating to the years between 47 and 56 in Britain. This is just to set up the the receptions that we're going to discuss in a bit. So the historian Donald Sassoon, author of 100 Years of Socialism, published in 1996, called 1947 the annus horrendus of communism. This was because communists were nearly universally excluded from the ruling anti-fascist coalitions in the West, which overwhelmingly chose social democracy over more militant political formations. Following the announcement of the British withdrawal from the Greek Civil War in March 1947, in which it supported anti-communist forces, US President Harry Truman addressed a joint session of Congress, and he said, "At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." End quote. This polarizing speech heralded the beginning of Truman's policy of containment of Soviet influence in the name of freedom and democracy. In response, Andrei Zhdanov announced, and I quote, "A new alignment of political forces has arisen. The more the war," that's World War II, "recedes into the past, the more distinct become two major trends in post-war international policy, corresponding to the division of the political forces operating in the international arena into two major camps, the imperialist and anti-democratic camp on the one hand, and the anti-imperialist and democratic camp on the other. The principal driving force of the imperialist camp in the USA, allied with it, are Great Britain and France. The cardinal purpose of the imperialist camp is to strengthen imperialism, to hatch a new imperialist war, to combat socialism and democracy, and to support reactionary and anti-democratic pro-fascist regimes and movements everywhere." So we see the world divided, and these two speeches kind of capture that essence, the early Cold War. The common form thus brought in a newly entrenched East versus West mentality. This also led to certain Western communist parties being excluded from the common form, including the Communist Party of Great Britain. Also planned in 1946, but enacted the following year, was the Marshall Plan, which was designed to alleviate the poverty of Western European nations, but perhaps more importantly, served to stem the westward flow of communism. As was brilliantly illustrated by contemporary Soviet cartoonists, the Marshall Plan quickly entered Soviet discourse as an imperialist trick or a bribe. It was thought to have yoked and hoodwinked the Western European nations to the USA. So he's holding a yoke that would go over a head, and it says "for Europe." In one cartoon by Stalin's favorite cartoonist Boris Yefimov, it even took the shape of a Trojan horse with Uncle Sam's top hat, from which legions of dollar coins marched boldly into Turkey, Greece, Italy, France, and Austria. The onset of the Cold War brought with it the so-called Battle of Ideas, which called for communists to fight the bourgeois and imperialist West on the cultural and intellectual front. Now, in Noreen Branson's History of the Communist Party of Great Britain, 1941 to 51, which was published in 1997, she explains that at the CPGB's 19th Party Congress held in February 1947, much stress was laid on the need to develop the ideological fields. So at its first meeting following the Congress, the party executive decided to set up a national cultural committee. And the function of this cultural committee was to plan and coordinate the activities of party members who worked in the cultural sphere, such as actors, musicians, writers, film producers, and academics. And at the same time, to link up with specialist groups, which included the Science Advisory Committee, a historians group, which we're going to come back to, an architects group, and committees of doctors, economists, philosophers, and so forth. It was, for British communist intellectuals, a welcome return to something that had been denied them for some time. So it was a return to the interwar period with the Popular Front, and it enabled, when they were fighting against fascism, there was a kind of an extra freedom that they enjoyed, and that was restricted to them for a certain time. During a different policy regime, but this felt like a return to the good old days for many of them. So when Emil Burns addressed the Congress in 1948, he said, "In the present period, the battle of ideas is of exceptional importance for the future of humanity. It is the task of communists to defeat the imperialist propaganda, to expose its class character, whether it finds expression in open politics or in concealed forms in ethical, philosophical, historical, or sociological ideas, or in the field of science, literature, or art. To do this job is for professors and workers at the bench, for lecturers and teachers, as well as for dock workers and labourers." Of the specialist groups of the NCC, that's the National Cultural Committee, the historians group was considered to be the jewel in the crown, and the core of the historians group consisted of 4 period sections. Number 1, the ancients, the classicists. Then there was the medievalists, then a 19th century section, and then a 16th and 17th century section. It was Gertrude Himmelfarb. It was, as Gertrude Himmelfarb has explained, another historian of this topic. It was in this milieu that some of the distinctive theories of British Marxist history were first formulated, about the nature of feudalism and absolutism, the development of capitalism, the character of the English Civil War, the relation of science and Puritanism to capitalism, the effect of industrialism on the standard of living of the working classes, the nature and role of labour aristocracy. The group also contributed to the new social history, history from below, the history of the common people, which became, as it were, a fellow traveller of Marxist history. So this moment was important for British historiography. The works of E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, and Christopher Hill occupied something of a hallowed space in British historiography. They were translated also, I've recently learnt, into Brazilian Portuguese. And it's my contention that the work of the ancient section should be just as well celebrated, even if their ideas are now long outmoded. Chief among these British communists or communist adjacent scholars are the prehistorian Professor Ver Gordon Child, who does appear to have been translated also into Portuguese, and a pioneer of ancient science, Benjamin Farrington, who has also been translated into Portuguese, it seems, although few have now heard of him today in Britain. The other figure of importance is the Birmingham professor of Greek, George Thompson, who was a member of the executive committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain and a crucial member of the National Cultural Committee. Now, the red lens that these men created, and the people I've given are only men, but there were some women involved, as I'm about to show. So this red lens that they created was one through which communists and fellow traveling readers viewed the ancient world, so that they created a new way to see classical antiquity. There were other members of the ancient section who I'm not going to talk about today, but I wish I could. One is Nan Holly, pictured here, who is a recent find, and I'm very pleased to have come across her. And she engaged in a lot of these kind of heated arguments about Athenian democracy and such, like in the British communist press, kind of taking on what the government was saying, and not allowing Greek democracy to be appropriated by the enemy to her in the Cold War. Robert Browning was known for all sorts of things. He was a leading Byzantologist. There's the pioneer of late antiquity, E.A. Thompson. Ronald Willett, who wrote a lot about Crete. He worked closely with George Thompson in Birmingham. And then there was an interesting chap called Rowley Wason, who's pictured here with Gordon Childe, who, according to some story, Gordon Childe was the one who kind of radicalized Rowley Wason while they were working together in Edinburgh. And then this is Rowley's wife, Margarita Wason, who published a fascinating little book called Class Struggle in Ancient Greece, published in 1947, which ended up being panned in the Labour Monthly, in a Modern Quarterly, by George Thompson, who was policing the application of Marxism to antiquity at the time very, very strongly. But her book needs to be reassessed, I think. Then there was Frank Wallbank, known to most because of his work on Polybius, and Jack Lindsay, who, if anyone was there last time that I spoke to you, I talked about Jack Lindsay, who engaged a lot with Catullus particularly. But they haven't got pictures today, I'm afraid. Together, before 1956, when the brutal suppression of the uprising in Hungary and the devastating revelations about Stalin's atrocities were made public via Khrushchev's not-so-secret speech, these British communist classicists fought bravely, mainly via popular non-fiction monographs and journals in the communist press, against imperialism and towards a proletarian revolution which never came. Thompson's most influential work was Aeschylus and Athens, first published in 1941 and much reprinted both in English and many other languages. With this book, he intended to study the art of Aeschylus as a product of social evolution. In this goal, he was building on the work of anthropologists, archaeologists, and sociologists, some of whom were already considered old-fashioned at the time, but who enjoyed sustained endorsement among communists, and especially in the Soviet sphere, due to the moment's rigid adherence to the evolutionary framework presented by Engels in his Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, which was printed in 1884. I think we can add to that it was kind of cemented in the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the short course, in which the fourth chapter, written by Stalin himself, was about dialectical materialisms. And that's when, at this moment, I think that was published in 1938, possibly 9 in English, I think in 9. And that's when things became very restricted and the dogma was perhaps at its height. But Thompson also sought to harmonize theory and practice, poetry and life. In this, he was driven by a desire to justify his own intellectual labor, his own interests, really. By 1949, he had become both more forthright in his aims and more explicit in his Marxism. In the early years of the Cold War, as a leading political figure, he was happy to admit that he aimed to reinterpret the legacy of ancient Greece in the light of Marxism and to rescue Hellenic heritage from the Mandarins, or else it will perish, destroyed by its devotees. His wider social goals are revealed in a speech he made to a meeting of the Executive Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain, in which he was clearly instructing other communist intellectuals on how they could or should apply their revolutionary politics in their professional lives. My subject, he says, is ancient Greek, and more particularly the writings of the Greek poet Aeschylus. And I remember how a year or so before I joined the party, I reached a complete deadlock in my work. I realized that its impetus was running out. It had no relation to the world in which I lived. Accordingly, I said to myself, either explain Aeschylus in such a way as to make him useful to the working class, or give him up. In 1953, in a letter to the editorial office of the Soviet Bulletin of Ancient History, he wrote, "As Marxists, we are partisan. We must conduct our research in such a way as to forge from them a weapon for the struggle of our time. First of all, for the struggle for peace." So this is very much, evidence of him using classics as a weapon in the Cold War. The French communist literary scholar Jean Valut drew attention to the fact that Thompson's work was constantly ignored by conventional, that is, non-Marxist or bourgeois French scholars. He detected a concerted effort, and this is on the slide, to make it go unnoticed. And this conspiracy of suppression or ignoring was no figment of the imagination. The Stanford professor Philip Harsh literally wrote in his Handbook of Classical Drama, published in 1944, "This work may be ignored." The negative attitude towards Thompson's work among mainstream Western scholars did not pass unnoted by Soviet critics. But if Thompson might have expected to find supportive criticism in the land where he felt his political ideas were close to becoming a reality, he was to be sorely disappointed. The major Soviet engagements with his work in the early 50s came in the form of 2 lengthy and unyielding polemics in the Soviet Ancient History Bulletin. But the historians, these came in by the historians Boris Gornung and Konstantin Zelin, who you see on the slides. For Gornung, the publication of Thompson's book is an outstanding event in the scientific life of modern martialized England, in which the pursuit of advanced ideas differs little from the United States. Here we can see the mandatory Cold War rhetoric coming through. Gornung even alludes faithfully to the despised Marshall Plan. His admiration for the book, for Thompson's book, is only muted by a requirement to denigrate it for its shortcomings in Marxism-Leninism. Gornung does not hold back on each perceived factual error and ideological slip. This is what they had to do at that time, was to make sure that they weren't seen to be pandering to Western scholars. They had to meet them head on and win, essentially, at this moment. And you can read more by Sergei Karpyuk on that particular phenomenon. At the end of his review, he writes, Does that work? Yeah, we have pointed out a very large number of shortcomings of the book of George Thompson. Lucky George. Nevertheless, all this does not detract from the enormous significance of the fact of the publication of this book at a moment when the whole world is split into two camps, when now in the camp of imperialism and atomic dollar diplomacy, every word in defense of the advanced ideology of Marxism-Leninism, especially every attempt to revise an entire scientific field in the light of this ideology, is regarded as communist propaganda, threatening the existence of capitalist civilization. Thompson's voice will ring out very strongly, and a lot of thunder will fall on his head. Now, one piece of evidence for Thompson's influence on British communist theatre makers is this reading list, which was presented to new members of Joan Littlewood and Ewan McColl's theatre workshop. And I found this in in Stratford, where East Stratford, the Theatre Royal, where they have an archive there, a very small archive. And it was really interesting to see these scholars being read by this group of theatre makers, like it was given to each new member. And as you can see, Thompson's featuring prominently, as do several of his key sources, including Engels. For Thompson, the forms of culture that mattered most were not those made for elite audiences, but those that were for the people and had a revolutionary social function. It is no wonder that this ethos was a driving force behind one of the most important theatre groups of the day, that is Theatre Workshop. Now, Theatre Workshop, founded by the working class communists, Joan Littlewood, born in 1914, and Ewan McColl, born in 1915, fought bravely in the cultural wars of the 1930s and 40s. Their major engagement with an ancient Greek play was with Aristophanes' Lysistrata, which they performed as a kind of slapstick comedy through the 30s, but with very, very high production value, Soviet-style aesthetics. But at the onset of the Cold War, so when they reunited after the war, World War II, they turned once more to Lizzie, as some of the cast call it, Lysistrata. This time it opened in London under the new name of Operation Olive Branch. And this production challenged the motives of World War II, presenting it as an extension of the class war by other means. And as we'll see, it also hinted that the wartime British government was colluding with arms traders. McColl said Operation Olive Branch was a more radical reworking of the text, in which, more radical that is than the earlier Lysistrata. It was a more radical reworking of the text in which soldiers' scenes were interpolated between scenes of striking women, and where recondite references to obsolete religious practices were cut out in favor of lines and short sequences borrowed from the Acharnians, the Thesmophoriazusae, and the piece. For example, Amphitheus crashes in as a deus ex machina, carrying the olive branch of peace, and there are other more subtle Aristophanic imports. Luckily, there exists in the Theatre Royal Archive a sound desk copy of the script, probably from the 1953 staging, when it was rebranded as Lysistrata, the sauciest classic ever written. Operation Olive Branch opened in Middlesbrough in January 1947 and toured numerous towns in northern England, as was the company's common practice of bringing theatre to the people. What's great about a sound desk copy is that you can get to see more or less accurately what was spoken on the stage, including things that were updated or excised. I especially like this substitution of lipstick for sword, which conjures a completely different atmosphere, I think. Preparation for every element of the play had been intense. The Theatre Royal Archives holds a folder of materials produced by the artist and lifelong Communist Party member Ern Brooks, who painstakingly sketched visual interpretations of the comedy's characters, drawing on his study of the scholarship chosen for the group by McColl and Littlewood. As can be seen in the remaining few production photographs, Brooks' designs were taken seriously. The actors' bodies and faces were contorted into the otherworldly stoops and grimaces of the artist's sketchbook. The hard work paid off. Operation Olive Branch made waves, winning for Littlewood her first London run, playing at the Rudolph Steiner Theatre in northwest London. The staging of the play was reported to take one's breath away. The pictorial beauty is astonishing, according to one reviewer. Nevertheless, it was not a commercial success. The show was pulled before its fortnight's run played out. Operation Olive Branch was quickly translated into German and performed in East Berlin, where it became popular enough to be brought out in paperback in 1948, and was restaged several times, including in 1961 under the joint direction of Littlewood and Horst Schoenemann. This production at the Maxim Gorky Theatre was also filmed and broadcast by the state TV broadcaster DFF. Littlewood encouraged the actors to improvise, drawing on their own experiences of the war. She wrote, I added a scene where soldiers shuffled away from the front, their feet swathed in sacking, as at Stalingrad. And those actors were magnificent. As it turns out, they had all been anti-Hitler. Some had been in camps. Some had been through the hell of winter soldiering in Russia. But of course, they hadn't expected to use their experience in Greek comedy. Her bold direction and commitment to the sanctity of satire were not in the least bit hindered by the austere theatrical atmosphere she felt surrounded by at Maxim Gorky Theatre. In her autobiography, she recalled how she had fun with Lampito, the girl from Sparta. First, I gave my impression of the tough Communist Party rep who attended my East-West press conference. It went down very well. All the actresses were dying to play the part. Mocking a party member, said Walter, who was the party representative in the company. Why not? Is the party above satire? As can be seen from Littlewood's recasting of the Spartan Lampito as an East German CP rep, there was at the heart of Theatre Workshop a fearless, urgent and irreverent responsiveness to the present. So what did McColl and Littlewood do with Lysistrata in Operation Olive Branch? Well, for one, McColl recast the title role, Lysistrata, as a British champion of the working classes. He put contemporary socialist political terminology in her mouth. This is no time for tears and lamentations. We have work to do. Lampito, you hurry back to Sparta and start things moving there. The rest of you will cover Boeotia, Corinth, and the Peloponnese. Work as you've never worked before. Organize all the women in your own districts, form area committees and rural groups. Organize. Aristophanes' doddering old men become just as doddering British World War I veterans, and their scenes echoed the Westminster ritual of the House of Commons. When in Act 2, the old men attempt to storm the occupied Acropolis, one of them, Kremilaus, remixes Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. Ours is not to reason why, ours is but to do and die. The extremely famous poem tells us the story of a doomed cavalry charge in the Crimean War in 1854. The messaging strongly encourages men to follow orders blindly and to die for one's country. And in the mouth of the geriatric Kremilaus, presumably charging at a snail's pace, it would have been extremely funny. Several of the old men evoked in their speeches the apocalyptic phraseology of Winston Churchill. In an attempt to demonstrate this in action, I'll first give the speech from Churchill and then follow it with McCall's parody. On June 4th, 1940, when the threat of invasion from Nazi forces was at its most intense, in the House of Commons, the British Prime Minister intoned, "We shall fight them on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." I'm sure some of you have heard that before. Now, this was picked up in Operation Olive Branch when a herald announces to the Senate that the women of Athens are at this moment marching on the citadel, at which the elderly Stremadorus exclaims, "Monstrous," before slipping into Churchillian prose. "The barbarians are at the gates. We must fight on the beaches, in the streets, in the clubs, in the barber shops." Then Cremulus, cutting in, asks Philocleon, "What's he saying?" Stremadorus continues, "There's only a handful of us, but we represent the very flower of civilization. Never were so many dependent on so few," which recalls another of Churchill's speeches in August of the same year, in reference to the debt owed by the British people to the fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force in battle with the German Luftwaffe. "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," which I realise, being Armistice Day, gains a little extra resonance. Littlewood, decades later, recalled that the old men bore a distinct resemblance to Churchill, Patton and their crew. McCall himself stated on BBC Radio in 1978 that the audience immediately recognised the cant phrases of hypocrisy. Such empty militaristic soundbites can indeed be read throughout the play and in parts of the Athenian old parliamentarians. A good example is when the magistrate reads from a report from General Cleon, who is absent from the assembly because he's having lunch with the Shield and Spear Manufacturers Federation at Pylos. Cleon's report is chock full of hackneyed expressions that convey nothing but a commanding and resonant reassurance that peace is just around the corner. The justification for war had been questioned at the end of Act 2, when the magistrate insists that this war is a war of the people in defence of our ancient way of life. Lampito answers, "It is a war carried on for private interest at public expense." But the best example of cant phrasing perhaps comes when the magistrate, in his response to the women's revolt, goes, "My friends," he begins, "our whole way of life, the very substance of our national greatness is in peril." Further down, he paraphrases Cleon, saying, "We must beware of all the foreign ideas before foreign ideas are un-Athenian ideas." Then in a powerfully stupid but sonically plausible intonation, I would go further, gentlemen, and say that we must beware all ideas, because at this stage of our history, all ideas are un-Athenian ideas. Sustained applause. The satire is as fierce as it is funny. The play is extremely critical of government decision-making and the jingoistic and militaristic jargon of Churchill's wartime speeches, all of which would have been extremely familiar to the public through all those BBC radio broadcasts. As briefly mentioned earlier, McCall also included what he called interpolated soldier scenes, essentially original scenes which depicted Allied working-class soldiers, mostly Scotsmen, killing time at the front. They talk and play cards. Their scenes balance effectively the women's struggle in Athens and create moments of emotive dramatic irony. The Scottish mariner's beloved husband, for example, who unbeknownst to her is under guard as a deserter, is stabbed to death on stage by a fellow soldier. and the role of the deserter was a mouthpiece for McCall's pacifist views. What's Athens to me that I should fight for? What's Athens to me that I should fight for? What has Athens ever brought to Anagria but duel and greeting? Athens to me means the wasted croft and the fell evictions of subfolk. The deserter's lines were written by McCall in a kind of fictional language called Lallands, a literary version, invented by the radical leftist Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid of the lowland Scottish dialect. The fell evictions that he speaks of are the Highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries, when thousands of Scottish people were evicted from their land by the English. The fourth soldier responds unconvincingly to the deserter's question, "We brought you civilization," before killing him in a rage. He is reprimanded pointedly by his comrade. "You killed him out of envy, because he loved he loved life more than your twisted death." McCall had intended to play the role of the deserter himself. The week before the opening of the summer of 1947, however, two plainclothes policemen operating on an anonymous tip-off arrested McCall himself for desertion. In the creative hands of Theatre Workshop, the seams of Aristophanes' Lysistrata were unpicked and a new play was skillfully woven together, uniting the company's political vision and world-changing historical events taking place around them. The company's commitment to their art as an active social instrument was remarkable. The theatre critic Kenneth Tynan would later describe Littlewood's dramatic contribution as the pursuit of a dream of theatre as a place of communal celebration, a left-wing shrine of Dionysus, dedicated to whipping the Puritan frown from off the popular image of socialist art. Now, I haven't decided to put together a particular conclusion to this talk, so I'm hoping that Beethoven will leap in here, because I wanted to keep it open. This collaboration and study is quite fresh, and I'm always looking for new people to work with. So I haven't found much yet of from the Brazilian point of view, but I'd be very, very glad to know if there are any interconnections that this work has maybe highlighted, or that would be very interesting to me anyway. So thank you for listening. I hope there's some people still there.
We thank you very much, Henry. Thank you very, very much for such a brilliant and stimulating, making think lecture. You talked about a relationship with what happened in Brazil. I wonder. But let me say this. I think that the idea that there is nothing intrinsically elitist or reactionary in classics is very significant. For me, it's a very important way of thinking. But I don't know if I would be wrong to imagine that there is a common sense that can make this association, classics and conservative ideas. So one question maybe is, how can we go beyond that common sense, and show to the society this not intrinsically relationship between one thing and another?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question. It's one I ask myself quite a lot. I think there are two ways of coming at it. One would be to have to admit that this the general, as you say, common acceptance. This is the perception, and not pretend otherwise, because that's not helpful. But there is a job that we can do, which will take time, but that is to challenge perceptions by presenting other versions of the classical antiquity. So that's why I think it's important to show that, for example, this was not the preserve only of these conservative groups on these aristocratic gentlemen, the mental furniture of the wealthy elites, but was also completely being used by the workers. And I'm convinced it's not just in Britain. I think it's elsewhere. But of course, every country has a different relationship with its culture and different times. So this is why I'm trying to show that both classical scholarship can be radical, can be alarming, this is why I don't mind showing things that are connected to leftist kind of atrocities. Like neither am I trying to protect that or defend it in any way, but this is just proof that it's a kind of tug of war. It's not just a slam dunk from the right. That's my feel.
Yes, I think. Thank you very much. And I think that the challenge that it faces to Brazilian context, because I recently investigated a 19th century poem, Brazilian poem that rewrote mythical metamorphosis of the relief of Rio de Janeiro and Brazil. And I can say that unlike what other South American countries did, which read the classics, looking for references to republicanism and cultural independence, here in Brazil, we saw a process of remodeling ancient mythology to preserve a monarchical system. It's completely the opposite.
Yes.
So far from saying that in Brazil there were no left-wing reappropriations of the classics, I think that in contemporary times we have seen more things like that. But I wonder here how to think about this phenomenon in Brazil in the 19th century and 20th century. I imagine that you don't have a reply. Of course, I don't expect that. It's not the case, but I just make this observation to point out, maybe to my colleagues, my Brazilian colleagues here, to point out that maybe we need to investigate it, to show it. I believe as well that many colleagues of mine here can say better than me on this subject, but it makes me think. So thank you about that.
Great, thank you. It reminded me of one thing that I came across when I was working with some people on a project called it was the Hesperides Network. They did a blog takeover, and there was a Brazilian example of, and I believe it's a kind of cheap publishing where newspapers are maybe folded over washing lines. I've got some kind of dim recollection of this. Does that ring a bell? Is it
not for me, but I have some colleagues that I'm sure that they know it.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Translating Virgil's Aeneid into Cordell literature.
Oh, to Cordell literature. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And this was a post written by Fabio
Cairoli.
Yeah. I found that very interesting. Yeah.
But it is a very recent job.
Is it? Okay.
Although Cordell is a very traditional and popular form of literature,
Okay.
This product is a very contemporary and produced by a professor, a scholar as well. Fabio Carolho is a colleague of mine, a colleague of us. He's a member of our Center of Classical Studies, and he does this kind of rewritings of the past, just translations and adaptations, but it's not actually a proper how can I say a working class product to working class readers.
I understand. I misunderstood, but it was at least kind of fusing together a working class tradition and
yes, it fuses together.
Yeah.
There is some questions or observations that we can read for the chat.
Right.
Let me see here.
Comments. I see.
If I'm not wrong, perfect. Thank you, Grace. Joan Littlewood version of Lysistrata through a Brechtian technique tried to bring classical plays to the theater to make it accessible to the working class. Do you see this kind of movement still now?
Well, that's a lovely question. I think, do we see it? Yes, we do. I'm not always sure that people would be completely comfortable with the way that's expressed, because it sounds slightly nowadays in the 21st century. It feels a bit condescending to be, targeting people according to their class, but definitely making accessible theatre for universally accessible, I think, is definitely going on. Brechtian in particular, well, that's a question, because I think in some way, like, I'm not a theatre historian, I have to declare that. I am very interested in it, but I imagine that, it's hard, and it always was in some ways, to sell that's pared down Brechtian, quite aggressive approach to audiences, irrespective of their class. But I think that in a competition with more musical theatre and who knows, like streaming platforms and such like, it would be a tough sell. But of course, people are doing this now. And but Lysistrata, yeah, it's going on. There are, you can check on the archive of performances of Greek and Roman drama at Oxford, and they are capturing all these performances, so you can see which ones are being produced, and in different places it's completely different. So it's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I think I'd probably have to phone a friend, but I'm sure it is happening. But I can't think of any good examples to give you right now, particularly of Lysistrata in the Brechtian style. I guess following the Ukraine conflict and the Russian invasion, I saw an uptick in Trojan women, particularly, and so right now. I saw in Prague a very good production of that, performed by Ukrainian refugees or migrants, and so it's interesting how different plays are called upon at different times for sometimes obvious reasons, but
And the question goes on: and ask you an intriguing question. Which approach can enable people to enjoy classics plays, or enable people to discuss Western economics and politics, the presence of the USA, European, Brexit?
Yeah, what can do that? From my experience I find that maybe if I would look perhaps to video games and film, maybe more so than to theatre as a medium via which these maybe not political. I can't see the question here, but that is making that is the way in which I see antiquity, especially classical antiquity, being most widely accessed by young people today. I've found is largely through video games, and yeah, so that's important, and that is going to bring in a whole new demographic, I think, to classics. But to create a platform for discussion of particularly of kind of modern politics, I think, yeah, the Greek plays are wonderful for that. It was interesting. I learnt recently that during the Cold War in the Czech Republic, there was a kind of boom of Roman comedy, particularly Plautus was being performed quite a bit, and that shows you, I suppose, that it's not only people following what is interesting and happening politically that they want to interrogate, but sometimes pressures operating on the people putting on the plays. For example, pressures of censorship and the like will also steer people towards particular areas of the canon, and sometimes in unexpected and surprising areas. I don't know if I answered the question, Beethoven, but I had a go.
I thank you very much. Do we have we more questions here? I don't think so. I can see the chat here, but I don't see any questions more, or at least a question that I can identify as a question.
Yeah, me too.
Let me just see with my colleagues if there is okay. Oh, I believe that we have one from my colleague Renata Casarini de Freitas. She's a Latin professor here in Federal Fluminense University as well. Yes. She thank you a lot for your talk. How was the connection of students with the communist forces in Britain in the post-war years?
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's it's an interesting one. There were immediately post-war, there was quite strong recruitment among students, and so to the Communist Party. It wasn't there. Yeah, since 1939, there'd been a dip in membership, but immediately in the post-war, so from 45, we had quite a lot of students joining the party. They also had quite a few of the people, the faculty members, also being. Until 1947, people were enjoying the same kind of rights of promotion and getting jobs without persecution. But when the Cold War really set in, and there's been a recent book on this, the promotions stopped really for people who were known communists, and it was very much less likely for them to get jobs. That said, that didn't affect the students, and the student population were in that period. That was one of the success stories of that particular period until '56, when obviously the bottom fell out, and it was just, there was complete need to rebuild, and that's when the new left came through, and people like Perry Anderson and E.P. Thompson did a lot of work in resurrecting, kind of defending the baby of communist thought against the bathwater of Stalinism, which had been so kind of graphically shown to be the case, and it was very hard to be a Marxist historian after '56, but so the students, I think it was a similar story. So so how were they engaging? How was the connection? Yes, so the connection was good. They joined and as well as teachers. High school teachers were quite a big faction in the party. So yeah, and student politics was, in the 1930s, that was a big, that was how a lot of the young British communists came to, and the 20s too. That's how they came to the Communist Party. But yeah, I think so. Yeah, but by '56, it was all wasted, I'm afraid, depending on your point of view.
I believe that we have one more question here. I don't know. Let me see.
Mm-hmm.
Renata, it's okay with the reply?
Thank you.
Just a second. Oh, there is another one. I think that one of the key things in the talks that the left-wing and right conservative movements both try to appropriate the Greek classics for their own means.
Mm-hmm.
Why then, specifically, how prevent extremists' approach to classics?
Yeah. No, I understand the question, and I appreciate that this is a risk, really, of showing of our being attracted to the extremes, because between them is probably where most of the action takes place. So it's difficult, but so I think it's very difficult to know what to give bandwidth to. What do you show? Because surely the kind of center is where most. I don't actually agree with the premise of the question, but I do understand why, having just given that talk, it comes across that way, because I've shown that the kind of far left, and we all know about the far right's attraction, but the business as usual classics, I would say, hovers quite squarely, kind of, well, to the middle, to the right, maybe. Although you ask someone in North America right now, and there will some people will say very clearly to you that that all university lecturers in humanities subjects are cultural Marxists or whatever. So it's but what the reality is probably something in that most engagements with Greek and Roman culture are not the extreme ones that we are tending to focus on. And that's, I guess, in a way, if that's what I've brought some attention to, then maybe we should remind ourselves that we need to provide balance from the center. I had an email from a colleague recently about wanting to collaborate on conservative classics, because he felt that conservatism had been hijacked by the right, and neo-fascism and stuff had taken the story away from the kind of more centrist conservatism that has done so much for holding on to. It pains me to say this sort of thing, but has a lot of perfectly benign conservative people have done a lot of wonderful and valuable work to the classics. I would push back at the question a little bit and say that it's my fault, but I'm showing an extreme for a particular reason, in order to combat the other extreme. But in the telling of that story, you've reminded me, dear questioner, that I need to be very careful in framing it, and showing that these extremes are not the norm.
Harry, my colleague Renata, remembered me to mention that recently we watched a series of Soviet animations that retold some ancient myths, like some heroes like Prometheus, Perseus, the Argo journey, the Argonauts, the history of Theseus and the labyrinth, the Minotaur. So there is a sequence of five animations, Soviet. They were produced in the 70s.
By a Georgian animator, I think.
Yes.
My friend, my colleague Hanna Pawlowska at Warsaw as well has done some work on these and on those particular animations, and they're great, aren't they?
Yes.
What do you think of them?
And if anyone has interest in seeing it in Portuguese with Portuguese subtitles, we have the 5 animations in our YouTube channel.
Oh, do you? Fantastic.
So
I'd like to have the link.
Yes, at the same address, at the same channel that this conference is being broadcasted, and subscribe to the channel.
Yes.
You and everyone.
Definitely, we should.
And it was an amazing opportunity here to discuss these animations and try to see how they reconstruct the myths, the narrative of the heroes, to propose a notion of life, of being in society in a way completely different in some ways from the past. So it was very nice to see them.
No, thanks for reminding me of these, because they're great animations, and they do disturb the normal reception. It feels quite otherworldly in an interesting way. That modernity is pressurizing them in interesting ways.
Yes, although there were histories of heroes, they behave as leaders of a collective, a collective project of society, and not as an individual one.
Yes, that's it. Oh, thank you for that's wonderful. And yes, and you're at the beginning of an exciting conference, aren't you? And so your conference is just kicking off, and I wish you all the best over the next few days.
So I think that we are going to, we reached at the end of our conference. I will thank you very much, Henry, for your talk, for your time, for all your words and your thoughts. And I thank very much to the attendance. Everyone now is congratulating you. So our Professor Kalinda. So nice to see you, and maybe in the future you can see you in Brazil in person.
I would love it. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.